All right, and we're ready for the next story, The Girl No One Wanted. There were once two sisters. The youngest sister was very beautiful, and her name was Rachel. But the older sister wasn't beautiful at all. Some thought her quite ugly, and her name was Leah. Rachel was the kind of girl who always gets invited to parties and chosen for the team. Everybody loved her. And poor Leah, no one hardly ever noticed her. One day their cousin Jacob came to stay. He was one of Isaac's sons, and he was on the run. Jacob had stolen and cheated and made some enemies, including his own brother, and now he was hiding. The funny thing is, Jacob, of all people, was the one God gave a special promise to. The same promise he had given his grandfather Abraham. I will rescue the world through your family. But then God chooses people we least expect, as we'll see. Jacob stayed a long time working for his uncle Laban. One day Laban said, Jacob, I've decided to pay you for your work. What do you want? A sudden thought struck him. How about one of my daughters? And there's Jacob and Rachel. Jacob looked at Rachel and he looked at Leah. Who would he choose? Of course he chose Rachel. I'll work 7 years for free, Jacob said, if I can marry Rachel. So Jacob worked 7 years, and at last his wedding day arrived. But that night Laban played a nasty trick on Jacob. Instead of sending Rachel to marry Jacob, he sent Leah. Now in those days they didn't have electricity, so it was dark in their tents. Besides, women wore veils and you couldn't see their faces properly, so Jacob suspected nothing. The next morning Jacob woke up and screamed. His new wife was lying beside him, but it wasn't Rachel, it was Leah. Jacob jumped out of bed. Laban, he cried, you scoundrel! But Laban said, work for me for another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel. So Jacob worked for Laban another 7 years, and at last Rachel became his wife. Now Jacob had 2 wives, but of his 2 wives, Jacob loved Rachel the best. No one loves me, Leah said. I'm too ugly. But God didn't think she was ugly. And when he saw that Leah was not loved and that no one wanted her, God chose her to love her especially, to give her a very important job. One day God was going to rescue the whole world through Leah's family. Now when Leah knew that God loved her in her heart, suddenly it didn't matter anymore whether her husband loved her the best or if she was the prettiest. Someone had chosen her. Someone did love her with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. So when Leah had a baby boy, she called him Judah, which means this time I will praise the Lord. And that's just what she did. And you'll never guess what job God gave Leah. You see, when God looked at Leah, he saw a princess, and sure enough, that's exactly what she became. One of Leah's children's children would be a prince, the Prince of Heaven, God's son. This prince would love God's people. They wouldn't need to be beautiful for him to love him. He would love them with all of his heart, and they would be beautiful because he loved them, like Leah. And next is about the forgiving prince. This one's about Joseph. Jacob had 12 sons, but of all his sons, Joseph was his favorite. One day, Jacob gave Joseph a splendid new robe. It was beautiful and rich with all the colors of the rainbows, but it made Joseph's brother jealous. They wanted rich rainbow robes too. Then, to make matters worse, Joseph kept having all these special dreams. I dreamed I was the greatest. I was king, Joseph told his brothers, and all of you bowed down to me. Now, I'm sure you know, even if Joseph didn't, that telling your brothers things like that is not a very good idea. Joseph's brothers hated him even more. They wanted to kill Joseph and his dreams. And one day, that's exactly what they tried to do. They tore Joseph's rainbow robe off of him and sold him to slave traders for 20 pieces of silver. There's that robe that they took off of him. The traders took Joseph to Egypt and made him into a slave. The brothers went home and lied to their father, telling them that Joseph had died. That's the end of that dream, they thought. But they were wrong. God had a magnificent dream for Joseph's life, and even when it looked like everything had gone wrong, God would use all of it to make the dream come true. God would use everything that was happening to Joseph to do something good. Meanwhile, though, things were not looking good for Joseph in Egypt. He was far from home and from his dad. Then he got blamed for something he didn't do, and even though he'd done nothing wrong, he was punished and thrown in jail. But God had not left Joseph. One night, Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt, had a scary dream about thin cows gobbling up fat cows. What on earth did it mean? He didn't know, but Joseph was a dream expert, so Pharaoh sent for him. It means a famine is coming, Joseph explained. There won't be enough food. Pharaoh was so pleased by Joseph's skill that he immediately took Joseph out of jail and made him a prince. Now back home, Joseph's brothers had run out of food and everyone was hungry. God's special family was in danger. If they didn't get food soon, they would starve to death. So Joseph's brother traveled to Egypt to buy food. There's a picture of the skinny cows and the fat cows. They came and knelt before the new prince. His brothers didn't know that prince was Joseph, but Joseph knew who they were. Joseph's dream, the one about his brothers bowing down to him, it was coming true. "It's me," Joseph cried. When they saw it was Joseph, his brothers were afraid. They had wronged Joseph. They had sinned and they knew it. Now Joseph would certainly punish them. But Joseph looked at his brothers and his eyes filled with tears. Even though his brothers had hurt him and hated him and wanted him dead, in spite of everything, he couldn't stop loving them. His heart, which they had broken, filled up with love, and Joseph forgave them. Joseph threw his arms around them. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Behind what you were doing, underneath everything that was happening, God was doing something good. God was making everything right again." Joseph didn't punish them. He rescued them. He brought God's special family to live safely with him in Egypt. One day, God would send another prince, a young prince whose heart would break. Like Joseph, he would leave his home and his father. His brothers would hate him and want him dead. He would be sold for pieces of silver. He would be punished even though he'd done nothing wrong. But God would use everything that happened to that young prince, even the bad things, to do something good, to forgive the sins of the whole world. And that is about Joseph. Next is about Moses. Joseph and his brothers grew old and died, but their children stayed on in Egypt, where they had become a very, very large family. Later on, a new king began to rule, but this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph, and he didn't like God's people. He made them into slaves, and he beat them, and he made them work harder and harder. God's people cried out to God to rescue them, and God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham. He would look after his people. He would find a way to set them free. One day Moses was looking after sheep when something caught his eye. And you can see there, it's a bush on fire. A bush was behaving very oddly. It was flickering with flames, but its leaves weren't burning up. He took a closer look. "Moses!" boomed a big voice. Moses leapt back. The bush was talking to him. "I have heard my people cry," God said. "I've seen their tears, so I have come down to rescue them. Go to Pharaoh and tell them to let my people go free." Moses was afraid, but God said, "I will be with you." So Moses went to Pharaoh. "Pharaoh," Moses began, God said, Pharaoh never heard of him. Moses kept on going. "God says let his people go free." "Why should I?" Pharaoh asked. "Don't want to?" "Won't." So he didn't. So God gave Pharaoh 10 warnings called plagues. First, God turned the river Nile into blood. No one could drink the water, but still Pharaoh would not let them go. So God made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping. "In your bed, frogs. In your hair, frogs. In your soup, frogs. All over everywhere, frogs. Make them go away," Pharaoh screamed. "Then your people can go." So God took the frogs away. Here's the frogs. But Pharaoh changed his mind. "Can't go," he said. Then God sent zillions of gnats. But still Pharaoh said no. So then God sent swarms of flies. Flies buzzing in your eyes, flies. And after that, sickness and horrible boils and huge hailstorms and a storm of locusts, then darkness when it should have been day, until it seemed that the whole world, creation and everything was coming undone, falling back into darkness and emptiness and nothingness. But each time Pharaoh said, "Make it stop, and then I'll let them go." And each time when God made it stop, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, "Actually, no, you can't go." Finally, Moses warned Pharaoh, "Obey God, or he will have to send the worst thing of all." Pharaoh just laughed. So God said, "The oldest boy in each family of Egypt must die, but my people will be safe." God told his people to take their best lamb, to kill it, and put some of its blood on the front doors. "When God passes over your house," Moses explained, "God will see the blood and know that the lamb died instead of you." That night it was just as God said. Suddenly, piercing the darkness, echoing down the halls of the palace, came a blood-curdling scream. Pharaoh's oldest son had died. At last Pharaoh did what God said. "Get out," Pharaoh shouted. "Just go." And so that very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this great rescue and call it Passover, but an even greater rescue was coming. Many years later, God was going to do it again. He was going to come down once more to rescue his people, but this time God was going to set them free forever and ever. And there are all of God's people as they head out to go to the promised land. And that, my dears, is all for tonight. Tomorrow we're going to read about God makes a way, which is more about the story of Moses, because Pharaoh changed his mind again. I love you both.